I never thought my life would unravel because of something my 9-year-old son whispered to me in the dark. Yet even now, years later, I can still feel the cold weight of that night sitting on my chest. It began so quietly, so deceptively, with the soft sound of Adam's bare feet padding toward my bedside. I remember thinking he was just thirsty or had another nightmare. He'd always been a sensitive child, imaginative, easily startled. But when he lifted the blanket and crawled beside me, his whole body was trembling so violently I felt it through the mattress. I brushed the hair out of his face, whispering that everything was okay, but the look in his eyes told me I was wrong. He grabbed my wrist with both hands, squeezing as if he believed I might float away. And then, in a voice so fragile it barely reached the air, he said, "Mom, don't go in Dad's room tonight." At first, I almost laughed. It sounded like something a scared child would say during a bad dream, a shadow imagined as a monster. But there was something in his tone that froze me, something that felt older than his 9 years, something carved by fear, not imagination. When I told him it was just his mind playing tricks again, his grip tightened to a painful point. That's when I saw it, his eyes, wide and shimmering with terror. Not childish fright, not confusion, terror, the kind of raw fear a child experiences only when they've heard or seen something they shouldn't. A chill worked its way down my spine as I whispered, "Adam, sweetheart, what are you talking about?" He shook his head so hard that his hair whipped across his forehead. "He told me not to tell you," he said, breath hitching. "But Mom, he's not who you think he is." Those words should have sounded absurd. I should have reassured him, brushed it aside, maybe even scolded him for letting his fears get the better of him. But instead, my stomach turned sharply, because deep inside, in the place where intuition lives, a truth stirred, the truth I had been ignoring for months. My husband had changed. Little things at first. A new heaviness to him. The way he'd lock his office door even when no one was home. How he'd step outside to answer phone calls and return with an expression wiped too clean, too composed. A calmness that felt deliberate. I'd asked questions, but he always sidestepped them with controlled charm. The kind that says everything and nothing. And yet, despite the unease that lived in the corners of our home, I convinced myself that marriage simply had seasons. But hearing my son say, "He's not who you think he is," cracked something open in me I had forced shut for too long. Before I could ask him anything more, the floorboards in the hallway let out a long, slow creak. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of that night, it cut through us like a blade. Adam jolted, his nails digging into my arm. His entire body curled closer to me as he whispered, barely forming the words, "Mom, he's coming." And in that moment, my pulse began pounding so violently, I thought he could hear it. I turned my face toward the darkened doorway, holding my breath without even realizing it, listening for the next sound. The creak was followed by a soft shuffle, as though someone was standing just outside our door. Listening, my throat tightened. My husband rarely walked the house at night. He usually slept like a stone. So why was he awake now? And why, of all places, was he outside the room where Adam and I whispered in the dark? I forced myself to speak normally, telling Adam to stay in the bed, that I was going to check. But he grabbed handfuls of my shirt and whimpered, "No, Mom, please don't leave me, please." His desperation was so fierce, so unlike him, it shattered any illusion I had managed to cling to. Something was truly wrong, deeply wrong, and my son knew more than he was saying. But I couldn't just stay frozen there. I needed to know who was outside the door. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as if they weren't mine. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the nightlight in the hall. I stepped toward the doorway slowly, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet. When I reached the threshold and looked out, the hallway was empty, or at least it looked empty. Shadows pooled near the corners, lingering longer than they should have. I called my husband's name softly, but no answer came. The silence felt staged, as if someone were holding their breath just out of sight. I returned to Adam, who was clutching a pillow to his chest like a shield. I tried soothing him, but he flinched every time the house made even the faintest noise. Finally, he murmured something that made my blood run colder than anything else that night. "He said you're not allowed in his room anymore," he whispered. "He said if you go in there, you'll ruin everything." He said this with such certainty, such parroted finality, that I realized Adam hadn't just overheard something. He had been told something. Directly, intentionally. I didn't know what to make of it. My husband had always been private, but never secretive, or at least, I thought. So why would he exclude me from a room in our own home? Why would he tell our child to keep me away? The more I asked Adam, the more he panicked. shaking his head and pressing his hands over his ears, as if afraid someone would hear. And every time he said Dad said not to tell, a wave of nausea tightened in my gut. What was so terrible, so dangerous, that Mark needed a 9-year-old to protect it? But before I could ask anything else, the door to the bathroom clicked shut down the hall, quietly, deliberately, and I knew, without seeing him, that my husband had been standing there the entire time. The next morning, everything looked normal, almost painfully normal. Mark made coffee, kissed my cheek, and asked why I looked tired. His smile was the same polite, calculated smile he'd been giving me for months, one that didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes traveled between me and Adam with a faint tension, as if he were checking to see if we had spoken. And when Adam hid behind me, refusing to meet his father's gaze, a flicker of irritation crossed Mark's face before he smoothed it away with that practiced calm. He asked Adam why he had come to our room last night. Adam froze. I stepped in and said he'd had a nightmare. Mark nodded slowly, still smiling, but something in his expression tightened. Nightmares, he repeated, almost amused. Kids imagine the strangest things. But his voice carried an undertone that made me feel like he was the one imagining things, or hiding them. Later that day, while he took a call in the living room with his back turned, I heard a name I didn't recognize. A woman's name. His posture stiffened the moment he said it, like someone trying not to reveal too much. His voice dropped low, but I caught fragments later tonight. She doesn't know, keep it quiet. When he hung up and noticed me standing in the hallway, he didn't look startled, not even guilty. He just gave me that same composed smile that was beginning to feel like a mask. I wanted to ask who he had been speaking to. I wanted to demand the truth, but something in his eyes warned me to stay quiet, not angrily, not threateningly, but deliberately, as if he expected obedience, as if everything depended on it. That night, the sound of footsteps returned, this time heavier, slower, deliberate, pacing outside Adam's room. I stayed awake, listening to every shift of weight, every creak of the floorboards, and at one point, the footsteps stopped right outside my door, lingering there too long for it to be accidental. When I finally opened the door an inch, the hallway was empty again, but the air smelled faintly like his cologne. That's when the truth began taking shape in my mind, not fully formed, but dark and unsettling. Something in my home was wrong, something in my marriage was unraveling, and my son knew more than I did. By the time dawn broke, my nerves were frayed. I decided I needed answers, and I needed them quietly. So when Mark went downstairs for breakfast, I followed, watching his every move with new eyes. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. He was calm. Too calm. A calmness that felt curated, calculated, like someone playing a part he'd rehearsed. And as he walked toward the basement, a place he rarely went in the mornings, I noticed something I had never seen before. The way he glanced over his shoulder to make sure I wasn't watching. The way he slipped something from his pocket before descending the stairs. The way the basement door clicked behind him, not fully shut, but not open either, just enough to keep sound from traveling. For a moment, I stood there frozen, the pieces swirling in my mind like storm clouds gathering speed. And finally, I took a single step forward, unable to stop myself, needing to know what he was doing down there so early. And when I followed him downstairs, I saw the first sign that my husband had been living a double life. I used to convince myself that our family was ordinary, maybe even blessed in the quiet, simple way that never makes the world jealous. But the truth is, sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves just to sleep at night. For years, I held on to the illusion that Mark and I were building a life together, to people fighting the same battles, sharing the same burdens. I didn't realize that while I was holding everything up, he was slowly stepping away, inch by inch, until the space between us felt like a canyon. I didn't see the early cracks, or maybe I saw them and chose to look away, because believing the truth would have meant admitting that the life I'd built was already slipping out of my hands. In those early years, I worked 2 jobs: morning shifts at the clinic, night shifts at the grocery store, while Mark kept talking about getting his business off the ground. He always said he was close, that one more investor meeting, one more weekend trip, one more networking dinner would finally make everything fall into place. And I believed him. I paid the mortgage. I paid the utilities. I cooked the meals and washed the clothes and handled every bill that arrived in the mailbox. Whenever he missed a payment deadline or forgot about a fee, I reassured him that we'd figure it out, that I would figure it out. Back then, I wore my sacrifices like a badge of honor. I didn't realize they were becoming the very chains that kept me in place. But it wasn't just Mark who changed. Around the same time his excuses became more polished, more rehearsed. Adam began withdrawing into himself. He was only 9, but I swear he looked older than his age, as if he'd seen things he didn't know how to talk about. At night, he'd refuse to sleep until I walked through the door. He'd sit on the couch hugging his knees, staring at the hallway like he was waiting for something terrible to appear. When I asked him what was wrong, he'd just shake his head and say, "Nothing, Mom. I just feel better when you're home." I told myself it was separation anxiety, that he'd grow out of it. I didn't realize at the time that children rarely fear shadows unless someone teaches them to. One night changed everything. It was the night after the hallway incident, the one where I heard something in Mark's voice that made me feel colder than the air around me. When I came home late from my shift, Adam practically jumped into my arms. He wouldn't let go of my shirt for a long moment, his little fingers trembling like he'd been holding fear inside his chest all evening. I carried him to his room and tucked him into bed, promising him he was safe now because I was home. He nodded, but there was something in his eye, something that felt like a secret pressing against the inside of his ribs, begging to spill. When I stepped out of his room, exhausted and overwhelmed, I noticed Mark's jacket tossed carelessly on the back of the couch. It was an expensive one, the kind I never understood how he afforded when his business still hadn't produced a single paycheck. Something nudged me to check the pockets. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the quiet voice inside me that had been whispering for months that something wasn't right. Inside the inner pocket, I found a folded receipt, crisp, clean, recently printed. It wasn't from a restaurant. It wasn't from a gas station. It wasn't from any place he'd ever mentioned. It was from a private office building downtown. A place I'd never heard of. A place he'd never had any reason to visit. And the amount on it wasn't small. My stomach tightened as I unfolded it fully. The description didn't make sense. Consultation fee, it said, followed by a name I didn't recognize. I stared at that line for what felt like minutes, while the house around me sat in silence so heavy it felt alive. When I asked Mark about it the next morning, I tried to approach him gently. Soft voice, calm expression. The way you speak to someone when you already suspect they might lie. He looked at the receipt, then looked at me, and smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't warm. It wasn't reassuring. It felt like a mask, a performance he'd practiced in the mirror until he knew exactly how to make it look convincing. "Babe, why are you worrying about this?" he said, still smiling that strange, wrong smile. "It's just business stuff. You wouldn't understand." And just like that, he slipped the receipt from my hand and tucked it into his pocket as if the conversation was over. I remember standing there, feeling like someone had tilted the ground beneath my feet. He had never spoken to me like that before, so dismissive, so patronizing, like I was a child interrupting an adult's train of thought. But what unsettled me most wasn't his words. It was the look he gave me right after, tiny flicker in his expression, quick and sharp, like he was challenging me to question him again, testing how far my trust would stretch before it snapped. I didn't push. I should have, but I didn't. Something in me hesitated, afraid of what I might learn if I pressed harder. I told myself I needed time to think, to observe, to gather the pieces before I confronted him again. But deep down, I think I was scared. Scared that I was living with a man I didn't really know. Later that night, as I tucked Adam into bed again, he held my wrist and whispered, "Mom, do dads ever get mad in their sleep?" The question froze my breath. I asked him what he meant, but he just stared at me, wide-eyed, as if speaking the truth out loud would make it more real. "Sometimes," he murmured, "Dad dreams really loud, and when he does, I don't like how his face looks." His voice cracked on the last word, barely audible. My heart clenched as I brushed his hair from his forehead. Children don't invent these things. Their fears always have roots. I wanted to promise him everything was fine, that dads sometimes dream badly, just like anyone else, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Not when the unease in my own chest had been growing heavier by the day. What was Mark dreaming about that frightened our son? What kind of life was he living when he walked out that door every morning claiming it was for us? And why did it feel like every answer I reached for dissolved before I could grasp it? That night, after Adam finally drifted off beside me, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars passing on the street, and the hollow beat of my own heart. I thought about the receipt, the lies, the strange office, the smile that wasn't a smile, and somewhere in that restless silence, I realized something I'd been too afraid to admit for years. Mark wasn't just drifting away from me, he was building another world entirely, one he didn't want me or Adam to ever step foot in. And when I found the second receipt, the one hidden even deeper than the first, my worst fear became undeniable. Mark wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding a whole other life. I knew something was wrong the moment the front door slammed so hard the picture frames rattled on the hallway wall. Mark didn't speak a word before leaving that night, just grabbed his keys, muttered something under his breath, and disappeared into the cold darkness like he couldn't get away from us fast enough. I stood there, watching the taillights fade, feeling the echo of that slam vibrate through my chest. But what unsettled me most wasn't his anger. It was the way Adam flinched, like he'd been waiting for that exact moment, like it confirmed something he'd already known. When a child reacts to silence more painfully than to shouting, you realize emotional violence has been happening in the spaces you never protected. After Mark left, the house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you, only exposes what you were trying not to feel. I walked into his office, a place I rarely entered because he always said it was his space. Somewhere he needed to think, to work, to plan for our future, but the future felt like a lie now. So I stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and coffee that had gone bitter. Papers were scattered across the desk, but not in a messy, creative way, more like someone trying to hide things too quickly. And then I saw it. The bottom drawer on the right, the only one with a little metal latch across it. It was locked. I had never noticed the lock before. Or maybe I had, but I never questioned it. Trust has a funny way of making you blind to the obvious. I crouched down and tugged at the drawer. It didn't budge. Something inside me stirred, a blend of dread and curiosity, the kind that makes your hands shake even as they reach for the truth. I whispered to myself that maybe it was normal, maybe he kept tax documents or old business files in there. But if it were something harmless, why lock it? Why keep it hidden? The air felt heavy, pressing against my ribs, telling me that this drawer held something that would change the way I looked at my husband forever. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Where's the key?" And then a tiny voice behind me answered, "Mom, I know where it is." I turned so fast the room spun. Adam stood in the doorway, pale, small, clutching the sleeve of his pajamas. His eyes weren't sleepy, they were alert, watching me with an expression no 9-year-old should ever wear. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "How do you know that?" He looked down at his bare feet, then back up at me. His voice, a whisper thick with fear. "Because I saw him hide it. He didn't know I was there." My heart dropped. Why would Mark hide the key in front of our son? Or worse, why would Adam be in a place where he could see something Mark clearly never intended him to see? I didn't want to scare him further, so I knelt to his height and asked him gently where it was. He pointed toward the bookshelf, second shelf, behind an old photo album. A place a child would touch, but an adult might ignore. That alone terrified me. Why would a man who guarded his privacy so fiercely hide something in a place his child could find? Unless he underestimated Adam, or underestimated all of us. With trembling hands I reached behind the album. My fingers brushed metal, the key. Something cold spread through me, as if I'd picked up a piece of winter itself. I thanked Adam softly, but he didn't leave. He stayed close, as though he needed to make sure I wasn't going to face whatever was in that drawer alone. I slid the key into the lock. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I doubted there was something inside, but because I knew that once I opened it, I couldn't pretend anymore. The life I had built, the love I had defended, the dreams I had poured myself into, all of it might unravel in one simple motion. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside was a single black folder, clean, unmarked, too deliberate. I lifted it with both hands, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but significant. When I opened it, the first page made my stomach lurch. It was a bank statement from an account I didn't recognize, with Mark's name at the top. Page after page showed withdrawals, thousands at a time, disappearing into nothing. Every line felt like a bruise against my chest, each number a betrayal carved into paper. I covered my mouth with my hand as if that would stop the world from spinning. The second page was worse. A business registration document, but not under Mark's name. Under a woman's name I'd never heard in my life. A stranger. A woman who, according to the form, shared an address different from ours. The registration date was recent. Too recent. I felt heat rush to my face, not from anger, but from humiliation, the kind that makes you feel foolish for every moment. You trusted someone who was slowly rewriting their life behind your back. But the third page, that's the one that made my hands go numb. It was a printed message, short, typed, deliberate. "She can't know. Not yet." My breath caught. The room felt too small, the walls too close. The words blurred for a moment, as if my mind refused to accept them. She can't know. Who was she? Me. The woman. Someone else entirely. And what wasn't I supposed to know? I closed the folder too fast, my pulse pounding in my ears. Adam stepped closer, placing his hand on my arm like he could feel the fear pouring out of me. But before I could process any of it, Adam spoke again. "Mom, there's something else." The tone in his voice froze me. I turned slowly, afraid of what he might say. He swallowed hard before whispering, "I didn't tell you before because I thought it was my fault." Nothing in the world prepares you for those words coming from your child. He told me about a night 2 weeks earlier. A night when Mark told him to stay upstairs, but Adam had gone downstairs anyway because he heard crying. Not shouting, not fighting. Crying. He saw a suitcase open in the basement, half filled with clothes I didn't recognize. He saw Mark sitting on the floor, his face in his hands, whispering things Adam couldn't understand. And then Mark noticed his little footsteps on the stairs and his whole expression changed. Cold, sharp, angry in a way Adam had never seen before. He told Adam to forget everything or there would be consequences. Adam didn't know what consequences meant, but he remembered the way Mark's jaw clenched. He remembered the threat in his eyes. As he described it, I felt my entire body go cold. The fear in Adam's voice, the image of that basement, the suitcase, the crying. It painted a picture far darker than an affair. This wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't even just deception. It felt orchestrated, calculated, like Mark was preparing for something. Building toward something I couldn't see clearly yet. And for the first time in my marriage, I felt afraid of him. Truly afraid. I hugged Adam tightly, trying to keep myself steady for him. But my mind was spinning, piecing together fragments that didn't belong in the same story. Missing money, a hidden account, another woman's name, a suitcase, crying in the dark, a message saying I couldn't know. And then, the locked drawer. Something inside me told me this wasn't about love, or even betrayal. This was something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous. I turned back to the drawer, needing to make sure I hadn't missed anything. My hands rummaged through the back section of it, touching nothing but wood until my fingers brushed the edge of another folder, thinner, hidden flat against the bottom. My heart pounded. I pulled it out slowly, afraid of what I might see, and when I did, the breath left my body because nothing prepared me for the document I found at the very bottom of that drawer. The one with my name on it. The moment I unfolded that final document, the one with my name printed neatly across the top, something inside me snapped in a way that felt strangely quiet. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a cold, sinking clarity, like stepping into water you didn't know was deep until your feet no longer touched the ground. At first glance, the paper looked ordinary, a standard authorization form. The kind you sign without thinking when opening a bank account or adjusting automatic payments. But when I read the signature, the shaky, lopsided curve of letters that were supposed to be mine, I felt my blood turn to fire. It wasn't my handwriting, not even close. Yet there it was, my forged consent, giving Mark full access to accounts that held nearly every dollar I had ever saved. Money from overtime shifts. Money from years of stretching paychecks to make sure he could focus on building his business. Money I told myself we were saving for Adam's future. All of it, suddenly in his reach because he had signed my name behind my back. I remember whispering, he wouldn't, then immediately correcting myself, he already did. That realization hurt more than anything else that had come before. Because cheating is one thing, emotional distance is another, but stealing your partner's identity, plotting financial destruction while sleeping beside them every night, that requires a different kind of darkness, a different kind of intention. And I felt something shift in me, something primal, protective, and ready to fight. But what happened next pushed me past fear into something far more dangerous. I confronted myself first. I stood in the mirror that night and looked at a woman who had been trusting, blinded, loyal to a fault. I stared at the exhaustion under my eyes, the worry etched into my forehead, the fear that had become too familiar, and I said out loud, "No more. He doesn't get to break me quietly." It's strange how empowering your own voice can feel when you've been silent for too long. The next morning, while Mark was at work or wherever he pretended to be these days, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. A woman recommended by a friend who once told me, half-jokingly, if your marriage ever explodes, she's the one you want in your corner. I thought I'd never need someone like that. I was wrong. Sitting in her office felt like stepping into a different reality. She listened without interrupting, without judging. And when I finally showed her the forged form, she didn't gasp or tremble or get dramatic. She simply leaned back and said, "This is premeditated fraud." Hearing those words out loud nearly made me crumble. She taught me how to protect myself. Quietly, strategically, she handed me a notebook and told me to document everything, every lie, every receipt, every interaction that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She explained how manipulation often hides behind calm tones and practiced expressions. She told me something that stuck with me more than anything. People like him rely on you, doubting your own instincts. Stop giving him that power. I walked out of her office taller than I walked in. From that day forward, I became deliberate, careful, observant in a way I should have been years ago. I set my first trap the very next evening. It was simple. I asked Mark a question only someone hiding something would react to. Not even a big question, just a casual sounding, "Hey, did you end up meeting that client you mentioned last week?" A client he never actually told me about. A fake detail I invented on the spot. His reaction was instant. To instant. He froze, not dramatically, just for a split second, but it was enough. Then he smiled, that lazy, too practiced smile of his that never reached his eyes, and said, "Of course. Why?" But the crack had already surfaced, the slight tremor in his voice, the way he avoided looking at me directly as he spoke. I recorded the entire conversation on my phone with a trembling hand tucked beneath the kitchen table. It felt wrong. It felt dirty. It felt necessary. And Adam, poor Adam, he stayed so close to me, it was like he was afraid I'd disappear. Every night he asked to sleep in my room. Every morning he followed me into the bathroom as if to make sure I wasn't alone for even a moment. He wouldn't go near Mark unless I was physically between them. Seeing fear in your child's eyes. Fear they don't even have the vocabulary to describe. It does something chemical to your soul. Something irreversible. Then came the night everything boiled over. It began like a normal dinner. The three of us sitting at the table. The clink of silverware. The quiet hum of the fridge. But Mark had that tightness in his jaw. I recognized the one he used when he was hiding something or preparing a lie. I asked him about a meeting he supposedly had that afternoon. Another lie I invented just to watch his reaction. And he took the bait. He nodded, saying it went well, but here's the thing. Earlier that day, I had tracked his location through a phone backup he didn't know I still had access to. He wasn't at any office. He hadn't met any client. He had been at a storage unit an hour away, so I looked right at him and asked, lightly, almost sweetly, "Oh, which client?" "The same one from last week." His fork froze mid-air. His pupils widened just a fraction. And then there it was, the slip. "Oh no, no, that was a different one. The first meeting was in the morning. Then I had the afternoon." He stopped, because he'd just contradicted his own lie from 10 seconds earlier. I leaned forward. "Morning? You told me it was in the afternoon." The silence that followed felt like a cut. Sharp. Immediate. Mark's face changed, not the mask he always wore, not the calm, collected manipulator who could gaslight me into questioning the shape of my own memories. This was different. A flicker, small but unmistakable, of frustration, of panic, of something unhinged, simmering beneath the surface. His voice lowered, turning colder than I'd ever heard it. "Maybe you should pay more attention to what I say." That wasn't a correction. That was a threat. A warning. A man letting the mask slip because he was tired of pretending. Adam shrank back in his chair, eyes wide. That was it. That was when fear stopped being enough. That was when anger took over, anger so fierce it felt like my veins were burning. I slammed my hand on the table and said, "Don't you ever talk to me like that again." That was the exact moment the room shifted. Mark stood up so slowly it made my skin crawl. "Are you accusing me of something?" I met his gaze without blinking. "I don't need to accuse you. I already know." His jaw clenched. His nostrils flared. And for a split second, I saw the man he really was, the one he'd worked so hard to hide. We argued for nearly an hour. Voices raised. Accusations thrown. His lies spiraling into contradictions he couldn't manage fast enough. And Adam heard every word. Every crack in Mark's composure. Every second of his unraveling. The next morning, as if he'd spent the whole night plotting revenge, thick envelopes arrived at the door. Legal papers. He had filed first. And the accusations in those documents were almost laughable. He claimed I was unstable, that I was paranoid, that I was financially irresponsible. It was projection in its purest, cruelest form. He even requested temporary custody of Adam, but he didn't know what I'd had already uncovered. He didn't know about the forged signature. He didn't know I had the hidden bank statements. He didn't know I had the recordings. He didn't know the lawyer had already prepared my counters. He didn't know Adam had told me everything. He didn't know that by filing first, he had handed me exactly what I needed to expose him legally. When I walked into that courtroom 2 weeks later, I wasn't the same woman he had underestimated. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't quiet. I wasn't his victim, and when the judge called my name, The entire courtroom froze because of who walked in right behind me. The moment I stepped into that courtroom, I felt a pressure behind my ribs that made it hard to breathe, as if every lie he ever told had grown into weights pressing against my chest. I could still hear Mark's voice from the night before, that cold tone he used whenever he believed he had outsmarted me. "You won't win. You don't have the proof." He said it so casually, like the outcome had already been written somewhere in the universe. But standing in the hallway before the doors opened, with Adam clutching my hand so tightly his knuckles were white, I made myself a promise. This time, the truth would speak louder than his confidence. This time, he wouldn't be the narrator of our lives. As I took my seat, my fingers trembled, but I kept my chin high. I wasn't hiding anymore. I noticed immediately that Mark looked different. Not on the outside, he still wore that immaculate suit, still kept his hair slicked back, like a man who never sweated, but something in his posture had shifted. He sat almost too still, like someone trying to rehearse calmness. He didn't look at Adam. Not once. And that alone told me he was afraid. A man who wasn't hiding anything would at least glance at his son. But Mark kept his stare fixed on the judge's bench, jaw tight, throat bobbing every few breaths. It was the first time I had seen fear show through the cracks of his performance. And even though I knew what was coming would be brutal, a part of me felt steady. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one keeping secrets. The atmosphere changed the moment the bailiff called the first witness. I heard heels clicking behind me, sharp and deliberate, and I felt every muscle in my body stiffen. When I turned slightly, my stomach dropped. It was her, the woman whose name I had seen on those documents in the locked drawer, the one I thought might have been his mistress. But the moment she walked to the stand, I could tell this wasn't the entrance of a lover caught in scandal. This was the posture of someone about to reveal a truth she should have spoken a long time ago. She didn't look at Mark. She didn't acknowledge him at all. Instead, she faced the judge with a face full of something that looked like guilt, resignation, and exhaustion. When she began to speak, the courtroom shifted. Even the air felt heavier. She explained everything. The business Mark had registered under her name, the accounts he had opened, the transfers he had conducted at odd hours, the meetings he swore were just to help a friend. My breath caught as she admitted that she had signed forms she didn't fully understand, trusting him because he convinced her she needed to play along for legal reasons. But then she said a sentence that made Mark jerk in his chair, his mask flickering for a split second. He told me his wife didn't need to know because he was preparing for a separation, and he wanted everything clean before it happened. The room froze. Even the judge leaned back. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. Clean. That word echoed through my mind like a threat whispered in the dark. So that was his plan. Not just betrayal behind my back. Not just secrets. He was preparing to strip me of everything and walk away with a life fully rebuilt under an alias. I stared at him, waiting for him to look my way, to acknowledge even an ounce of wrongdoing. But he didn't. He kept his gaze lowered, blinking rapidly, breathing tight. He wasn't calm anymore. When the prosecutor presented the documents next, I felt my stomach twist. They projected everything onto the courtroom screens, large, unavoidable, merciless. Every bank transfer, every signed form with my forged authorization, every email exchange in which he told that woman not to overthink the money movements. People in the gallery whispered. A few gasped. One older man even shook his head with a soft, "My God." The shame that washed over me in those moments wasn't because of anything I had done, no. The shame came from realizing just how thoroughly he had planned to bury me while smiling across the dinner table as if we were fine. As if our son wasn't already sensing the storm rumbling beneath the floorboards. But even then, even with evidence inches from his face, Mark straightened in his chair like he still believed he could rewrite the narrative. And when he finally spoke, the courtroom learned just how far he would go to protect the illusion of his innocence. His voice carried that familiar calm to calm, unnaturally calm as he insisted he was being framed, that the documents were manipulated, that the woman was lying because she was emotionally unstable. He even suggested I had pressured her to testify. The judge glanced at him with a raised brow, the kind that silently asks, "Are you really going down this road?" And then came the moment I had dreaded more than anything, the moment Adam was called. He squeezed my hand before standing, and I knelt to his level, brushing his cheek with my thumb. "I'm right here," I whispered. "You tell the truth, baby, that's all." His chin trembled, but he nodded bravely. Watching him walk to the stand felt like watching my own heart step away from me and into the light. He sat down, feet dangling above the floor, hands folded in his lap. The judge softened her voice, gentle and patient, and asked him the question that would change everything. "Adam, why are you afraid of your father?" The silence that followed was unbearable. I didn't breathe. Nobody moved. Adam looked down at his hands, and for a moment I thought he might break down. But then he inhaled a shaky breath that carried months of fear, and lifted his eyes. Because, he whispered, he told me if Mom ever found out what he was doing, he'd make sure she disappeared. He said he knew how to fix problems. And I didn't want her to be a problem. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a physical wave. Mark jolted upright, face flushing red, mouth opening in protest, but the judge slammed her gavel once, silencing him instantly. I felt tears blur my vision, hot and overwhelming, hearing my son repeat those words no child should ever have to hold inside. It broke something in me and rebuilt something stronger in the same heartbeat. I wasn't imagining the danger. I wasn't exaggerating. My son had been protecting me. Mark tried to regain control. He leaned forward, voice cracking as he said Adam was confused, that children misinterpret things. But nobody believed him anymore. Not after the documents. Not after the accomplice's testimony. And certainly not after hearing the terror in Adam's voice. The prosecutor then presented the last piece of evidence, an audio recording. My stomach knotted. I knew exactly what it was. The first trap I had set. The night I asked him a question about the missing money just to see how he reacted. They played it loud enough for everyone to hear his tone shift from defensive to icy as he said, "I told you to stay out of it. Don't make me do something we both regret."